In this video, we're talking about complex numbers, and when we say complex numbers, we're talking about the square root of negative numbers. Up until this point, we've only been able to take the square root of positive numbers, but sometimes we need to be able to represent the square root of a negative number, and the only way that we can do that in mathematics is to use this number I, where we say I is equal to the square root of -1. If we assume that that's the case, that I is equal to the square root of -1, then we can say that I squared is equal to -1 because we would just square both sides of this equation here. We'd get I squared on the left, and we'd get the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 on the right, which would just give us -1. So we need to remember these two things, that I is equal to the square root of -1, and that I squared is just equal to -1. With that in mind, we can simplify expressions like these ones. So we have here the square root of -2 times the square root of -3. Well, what we need to realize is that the square root of -2 here is really just -1 times 2 inside this square root sign, and that the square root of -3 is -1 times +3. Of course, -1 times 2 is -2, so we get back to this original number, and -1 times 3 is -3, so we get back here. So we can sort of factor out a -1 from both of these values. Then, of course, when we have two numbers that are multiplied together inside a square root, we know that we can separate them into different square roots. So the square root of -1 times 2 is the same thing as the square root of -1 times the square root of 2. And the square root of -1 times 3 is the same as the square root of -1 times the square root of 3. Now we know that the square root of -1 is I, so we can say I times the square root of 2 times I times the square root of 3. When we say the square root of 2 times the square root of 3, we can combine those together into the same square root to get the square root of 2 times 3. And then we have I times I, so we're going to get I squared. 2 times 3 is 6, so we get the square root of 6 times I squared. But we know that I squared is equal to -1, so we're going to multiply this by -1. And then we just want to put that negative sign in front, so we're going to get negative square root of 6, or the opposite of the square root of 6. Now here we have a different example. We have the quantity 5i minus 2 times the quantity 4 plus 3i. And because these are just two binomials multiplied together, we can FOIL them out like we'd FOIL any other binomial. So here we'll do 5i times 4 is going to give us 20i. 5i times 3i is going to give us 15i squared. -2 times 4 is going to give us a -8, and -2 times 3i is going to give us a -6i. When we say 20i minus 6i, we'll get 14i. Here we have 15i squared. Well, we know that I squared is -1, so we'll say plus 15 times -1, and then we have our -8. So we'll get 14i, and then 15 times a -1 is a -15 and a -8. So what we end up with here is 14i minus 23. But when we end up with a complex number like this, it's conventional to always write the whole number first. So we'll put the -23 first, followed by the number that contains I. So we'll say -23 plus 14i, and that'll be our final answer.